Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Kelsey Wilhelm. Our guest tonight is Lobo, an author and management expert who has embarked on a historical exploration of his grandfather, renowned businessman Pedro Lobo, who helped shape as well as save Macau. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. Pleasure to be here.
Now, this is a very, very interesting topic, and you are obviously very well acquainted with the figure, especially having delved into it. But before we talk about Pedro Lobo himself, who is your grandfather, I wanted to ask, why did you choose to go into this, to go on this journey to figure out more about his life?
Okay, well, I think you know the background that the biography itself was commissioned by the International Institute of Macau, the IIM. They had been looking for somebody to write about Pedro Lobo's life, and they hadn't been able to find anybody who could take on the big task. They had asked me a couple of times. I had politely refused because it was, I knew it was going to be such a daunting task, and it was such a daunting task to complete. I had rejected it because we as a family had considered it to be a very private matter. And when I came to the Writers' Festival in 2018, I was introduced as Pedro Lobo's grandson, and I realized, well, you know, he's still a very loved and important guy, and you know, the legacy doesn't belong to our family. It belongs to the people of Macau, and I should put it out there for them. So that's why I've taken this on. And the book is actually dedicated to the people of Macau.
Okay. I mean, such an important figure. I'm sure that people must have their own memories of who he is, who he was. Do you think that you're going to find that there'll be various feedback once the book does come out of people on both sides of the fence, both supporting and possibly not supporting?
Yeah, well, I welcome it. He was in many ways very, very controversial, running the economics department for the government, and at the same time having his own private businesses alongside that. So yeah, there were people who didn't think it was fair, but you know, in the end, he did what was needed, as you said, to save Macau, and I think that's what he's best remembered for.
Now, you did get to meet him, correct?
Oh, of course, yes, I did, and you know, the last time I saw him was at his deathbed in his hospital. It wasn't the day that he died, but you know, I was just a very young kid at the time. And I didn't know him as politician or businessman. He was my grandfather. And so learning all about those aspects of his life really was a big journey for me.
So let's take it back to the very beginning.
Sure.
He was born in Timor-Leste.
He was born in Timor-Leste, and he was adopted at birth, in fact. So he was adopted, his birth parents were Lobo, and he was adopted by Dr. Bellarmino Lobo, who was the head of the Dili General Hospital. So pretty lucky for him. There still is that tradition in that part of the world to hand off children that you can't properly look after to a close relative.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And what brought him to Macau initially? I mean, he came here around 1901?
1901.
It's a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, and at the time there had already been established a route for children, boys, to be educated at the seminary.
Okay.
So
this is St. Joseph's Seminary?
St. Joseph's. So he wasn't the first. He was, and many of these had gone back and become prominent political figures in Timor after the return, with a good education.
Why do you think he stayed on?
Timor, in fact, was a very difficult and violent place. It didn't actually put down the local uprisings until something like 1913.
Okay.
There were a lot of wars, and I'm sure his father probably encouraged him to, you know, not go back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after his time in the seminary, he ended up, was it straight? He didn't directly become a teacher.
No, he didn't.
He
went to an accounting course, and he studied accounting. and then later on he got a job as a mathematics teacher.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then he eventually ended up working with Banco Nacional Ultramarin, but BNU, which was
Exactly.
quite young at that point.
Yes, yeah, in his early 20s, he was actually considering whether he should go back to Timor, and he was encouraged by a couple of Jesuits from the seminary to stay in Macau, and through them they introduced him to the officials of the bank, and he got a clerical job there.
Okay, and that kind of led him to learning more about Macau's finance system, and obviously laid the groundwork for his future success with companies such as the Macau Cooperative Company.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So before
CCM.
he went from teaching into banking, and then banking into government service.
That's right. So the BNU was established something like 1902, if my memory is correct, and in Macau. Pretty quickly, it had taken over the finances of the Leal Senado, so it became sort of Macau's central bank.
Okay, Leal Senado is Macau's municipal
Yes,
body. Okay.
the municipal, yes, the lower Senate. So. Yeah, so he learned the ropes. He understood what was happening, how the money flowed and where it went and how it was used. And, you know, being a pretty bright guy, he actually developed some insights as to what needed to be done to shore up Macau's finances. Yeah.
And so Macau was going through a very, very difficult time, and well, the whole region was, because at the time that he was here, we were also experiencing the invasion of the Japanese, both in Guangdong and Hong Kong as well. But Macau didn't seem to be as affected by that, and it seems like Mr. Lobo played an important role with that.
Yeah, there were a series of incidents. They were so common in Macau that it almost became a commonplace that you expected bad news all the time.
Okay.
And it wasn't only, you know, the invasion of the Japanese. It was things like, first of all, the revolution in Portugal, you know, in 1910, followed by the revolution in China. And I mention these things because, you know, a revolution for the overthrow of a monarchy to become a republican movement might mean one thing in a mother country. For a colony that is told that you love king and country, to be told that you don't anymore is a big deal. So that moves on into, yes, and there were some very strong Republicans in Macau at the time as well, some governors too.
Okay.
Then the Republican movement in China, and your listeners probably know that Sun Yat-sen, you know, played a great role in that through Macau. There was right after that, there was the First World War. You know, there was the Second World War, the invasion well, before the Second World War, even then, 1937 was the invasion of the Japanese in Manchuria. And that, you know, experts say that was the real start of the war in Asia.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, you know, the invasion of Hong Kong. And that, you know, grew the population from 80,000 to 400,000.
Yeah, yeah, and that caused huge problems, including food shortages.
Massive problems with food shortages. People were eating anything that they could find on the streets. There was a lot of death. There were, you know, there was even reports of cannibalism. So there was a real urgency to do something about the food thing. So that's how the CCM, the cooperative company, was established.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was he the only founder of the company? Or no, the CCM was it was thirds, right?
It was thirds. Prominent, wealthy businessmen, many of them from Hong Kong, the Macau government, and the other part was the Japanese military police.
Okay.
So the Kempeitai.
That seems like a bit of a contradiction given what was happening regionally.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, and this is a big issue with a lot of people saying, why do you want to support the Japanese or collaborate with them or whatever? It wasn't really that. It was about for Macau's survival. So, you know, the things that needed to be done needed these three parties together. You needed the safety of the Japanese there to protect your shipments and to be able to procure food in China. You need a mechanism for administration, which was the government, and then you needed money. And so these three things came together to form a company, and it was run by him.
What did the company primarily deal in?
In foodstuffs.
Yeah.
So anything that could be sold or traded, machines, even things that were needed sometimes were sold. Later in the war, they actually traded a gunboat, a Portuguese gunboat for rice, even though that was something that the Portuguese really wanted to keep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did your grandfather build himself into the success story the various success stories that exist about him in Macau?
Yeah. That's a great question. I guess I'd been asked this question before. I think that he'd recognized through his various roles in, for example, in the bank, and just living through it, that there was a power vacuum. Okay. And that power vacuum was created by the frequent rotation of governors.
Okay.
So there needed to be constant administrative and strong administration, and he built a structure around that, and he stayed. He was an outsider coming from Timor, but his own father was an outsider because he'd come from Goa, and he realized that an outsider can do something. You have to step into that place that was needed. Yeah.
And he stepped all the way into the role of the president of the El Senado.
Yes.
And
yes.
And he was in that role for quite a few years. How? Yeah. 1959 to 1964. Now, did that came quite a bit after his time in government service, or was that kind of a natural progression?
Well, he had taken, yes, it was a natural progression because he had taken the vice presidency as well. Okay. So he actually worked his way through that. And as I think a lot of the viewers will know that El Senado was, for hundreds of years, was a group that was formed by local businessmen and traders. And he was certainly one of those. So that it was pretty natural for him to get involved in that.
And I mean, he was such a powerful businessman that even, you were mentioning earlier that you had a secondhand account of what happened when the Japanese arrived at the Portas do Cerco, right, at Macau's border gate.
Yes.
And they began firing on Macau.
Exactly.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the Japanese had just invaded Hong Kong, and there was a lot of worry that this was going to happen, even though Macau had declared neutrality as part of being Portugal. And the Japanese were somewhat respecting it, but threatening by lobbing shells, into the islands like Lapa, etc. This has gone on for a few days, so people's nerves were really rattled. And my grandfather, he was a very little guy. I don't know how he got the energy or the guts to do this, but he got into a car and he drove to the border gate, or was driven to the border gate perhaps, and asked to see the commander. And eventually the commander came, to the gate to see him, and he said, "Look, we're not your enemies. Why are you doing this? In fact, you should regard us as your friends. So why don't you just share some food and drink with us?" And from that point in time, he actually did, I suppose, lull them into a sense of, complacency or something about Macau. And he would entertain them and put them on his side. And from then, they wanted to deal with him rather than the governor. So that actually, strengthened his position here.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was his I know that he made his fortune using various means, but what was his relationship with gold? I heard that there was an agreement that particularly placed Macau as a beneficial area to be in to trade gold.
Right.
Did he take advantage of that?
Yeah, and this Macau's economy has always been an economy that's been supported by non-traditional industries. So you know, firecrackers and matches was not going to sustain it. It was, you know, it was basically fishing firecrackers and things like that. What supported the government to the tune of about, I think, 20% of its revenues was opium.
Okay.
So after the fall of the nationalists and when the communists had actually taken over, they were in the process of taking over, because that actually took a long time to do. You know, you can imagine that China was actually, having lost Hong Kong as a concession through the Opium Wars, was very anti-opium, even though it was very widely trafficked in China as part of China's own you know, economic benefit. The nationalists were doing this. So the Portuguese government basically said, well, okay, you know, we've got to protect Macau, let's get rid of the opium.
Okay.
And opium then transferred into gold, because in 1942, I think the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed, and that was, there were, I think, 40 or 50 signatories that said, okay, we're going to respect that there is one price for at $35 an ounce for gold. Portugal was not a signatory, and therefore Macau was not bound to that. And as soon as that happened, and there was, you know, recognized that it was a very, very strong demand for gold. For example, China was under embargo, etc., and needed currency, foreign currency. So there was a very, very strong demand of gold, and basically the economic department took over the licensing of that. So that's basically how it happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, to the point where he had set up the Hengchang Company, the Macau Air Transport Company was something that he had set up. And so what exactly was the function of that? Okay,
so originally my father and my grandfather had set up a company in Hong Kong in 1946.
Okay.
They had been approached by a couple of Australians who owned a small airline called Cathay Pacific.
Okay, I've never heard of it.
No, it's some obscure, you know, low-cost airline. Anyway, so they asked my father to be the handling agent for Cathay Pacific.
Okay.
And then they said, well, you know, how about we also fly into Macau? And my father said, well, we don't have an airport. And they said, well, being really smart guys, they said, well, you know, let's get some seaplanes.
Okay.
Land in the sea. So that was a passenger service and a cargo service.
Okay.
And they very quickly realized that you could fly gold pretty quickly. You know, it was a 15-minute flight from Hong Kong. And take quite a lot of it.
Okay.
You know, so the Matco became a freight aircraft liner, primarily shipping gold.
Okay.
Well, people and gold, but the gold was the lucrative part of it.
So they could go to Hong Kong, purchase it $35 an ounce, load it onto the plane, fly it over, and sell it at up to 70.
Yeah, they weren't always the owners of the gold.
Okay.
So they would fly it for people at a price. So every ounce of gold that was flown by Matco by other people to bring it to Macau, who then were able to trade it, but then recognized that the trading had to be licensed by the economics department. So there was that gold monopoly.
Aha.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What about some of his other roles? I mean, well, obviously, still in regards to gold. We know that Ian Fleming came through town. Did he actually meet your grandfather?
He did, but I have to, you know, people say that he was the inspiration of Goldfinger. And no matter how many times I say no, he wasn't, because Goldfinger was written the year before, released the year before he met Ian Fleming. There'll be people who want to believe that. Yeah, so he met Ian Fleming, and Ian Fleming wrote an account of that in, I think the book was called something like Amazing Cities or something.
Okay.
And he basically did it for entertainment, and he wrote this account of their meeting like he would have written a screenplay for Peter Sellers.
Okay.
It was comedic.
Okay.
Yeah, and people who will have watched that really great James Bond movie will recognize this big hulking character called Odd Job, and he actually wrote a couple of Odd Job characters into that as well.
Okay.
But, yeah, hope to eventually debunk all of that, but it's kind of fun to talk about.
All right.
Anyway.
Just for the audience members who don't know, Ian Fleming was the author of the 007 books,
Correct.
which then led to the James Bond continuing saga.
Yeah, exactly.
He also had other, they could be called commercial pursuits, but also more artistic pursuits. He set up a commercial radio station.
Yeah,
well.
yes, he set up a commercial radio station. I would doubt if that radio station ever made any money. I mean, he probably poured a lot of money into doing that. And that was basically to support the dissemination of Portuguese culture and language.
Okay.
And this is part of the Macau cultural circle. And there are reports that Radio Villaverde was heard as far away as Tasmania.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the Portuguese language and in Chinese as well. And that station was built as part of his home office complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But then he also, I don't know if he broadcast himself, but he composed as well, right?
He composed. He learned musical composition at the seminary.
Okay.
He wasn't great at writing music, but he was supported by, I think, an Austrian Jesuit who said, look, just hum it to me and I'll write it down. And so they collaborated in producing a lot of works.
Okay.
Yeah, and then he assembled an orchestra. He played the violin himself, and he assembled a couple of dozen musicians, and they formed the Villaverde Orchestra.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they were broadcast through the radio channels.
Yes, and they also played operettas and things that he'd written at, some of them performed at the Dom Pedro Theatre here in Macau. A couple of big ones like that. So yeah, he was certainly, had aspirations to be a musician composer later in his life when he wasn't as busy with his work in government.
There's so much that encompasses the life of Pedro Lobo. And I know that you delving into it must have had to hear various accounts from various people and then try and find the true middle ground of what was being said and the person that he was.
Yeah, certainly.
Was it difficult did you find any surprises within the accounts, some of the stories that you weren't expecting, or was it more or less in tune with the person and the persona that you know?
I would have to say that I approached this as a person who didn't know very much about his life, and I had to. There aren't that many people who alive today that knew him, but I do have older relatives that did. I do have some cousins, etc. And I collected all the stories. I sort of matched them against each other's stories and then realized, that some of this couldn't be true. I had to use, various timelines and actually what was happening at the time. And certainly some of these things are like the Ian Fleming story. They're just hearsay. So, everything I've tried to be as factual as possible. It's possible that I've made some errors as well, and hopefully if somebody recognizes that I have, please tell me. I'm as curious as anybody else to know the real story of Pedro Lobo.
And this isn't your first work as an author. You've also written numerous books before.
Yeah, I've written. This is my fifth. The previous four are fiction works, and this was a real different discipline for me to get involved with.
I bet.
So they've been historical fiction, so I knew how to research the background and to do the setting for the story, but in this case, my character was someone real, so I wasn't able to take any artistic license with that.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
What drove you to write in the first place, to become an author?
I've always had it in me. My background is business and economics, and I've always written very dry economics and stuff and business reports. And I realized about sort of a dozen years ago that the family has stories. And I was on a trip in Europe and in Portugal at one time, and I decided, well, I think I'd better start writing some of this down. And then it just started going.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so far you've written Jinkan, The Witch Hunter's Amulet, Mesquita's Reflections, Atavist?
Atavist is a Japanese-themed one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was your most recent?
No,
Which was
Jinkan is the
Jinkan
most
is the
recent
most
one.
recent,
Yeah,
okay.
and that was just launched in October of 2019.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, great. I need to get my hands on a copy of
Oh,
it.
please do. I need all the help I can get.
And speaking of the launch, the release date you're looking forward to next year, early next year?
Yeah,
for
the Pedro Lobo book will come out will be out in February. The official launch should be March 2020 in Macau.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I very much look forward to reading it, and thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to be back.
We'll see you in March, hopefully.
Okay, great, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all from TDM Talk Show for this week. Join us again next week for more. Good night.